It's now a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, cultural critic and queer theorist Jack Halberstam. Halberstam has written 5 books on a range of topics, including horror film, feminism, transgenderism, failure, anarchy, queer visual culture, and subcultures, and is the author of the seminal publication In a Queer Time and Place, Transgender Bodies, Subcultural Lives, which is a book from 2005, and it has since become a foundational text in the development of queer theory. Jack Halberstam also blogs at bullybloggers.com, and he's currently finishing a book on the wild. He will be presenting a talk entitled On Being Late and Other Short Essays on Becoming Ex-Human. Please give a warm welcome to Jack Halberstam.
Good evening. Well, I guess my title was appropriate. Here we are. It's late. We're on queer time now, folks. This has been a super straight event. Apparently, reproduction and extinction go hand in hand. Who knew? So let's see if we can queer this topic a little bit. I've got 5 mini essays. The first one is on Dead Parrots, and if you've heard this Monty Python skit, as you all have, you can kind of sing along with me. But once we get to the end of that, we're going straight into zombie territory, and I'm sure you've all been sitting here all day wondering, when are we going to get to the zombies? We have arrived. Okay, so, all right, so let's start with the Dead Parrots. So I'm tempted to begin by saying, and now for something completely different. In a famous Monty Python skit, a man returns to a pet store with a parrot lying face up on the bottom of its cage. I wish to complain about this parrot, what I ordered not half an hour ago from this very boutique. What's wrong with it? Asks the not very interested store owner. It's dead. That's what's wrong with it, says an indignant John Cleese. Nah, responds the shop owner, Michael Palin. It's just resting, stunned. He continues, and then a little later on, pining for the fjords. Cleese persists. Pining for the fjords? No, this parrot is no more. It has ceased to be. It has expired and gone to meet its maker. This is a late parrot, an ex-parrot. Okay? So we are the dead parrot in this skit. We are the ex-human. The Dead Parrot skit has been immortalized recently by a huge Norwegian blue sculpture by Ian Prendergast, lying flat on its back in Potter's Field, announcing its own extinction and at once its continuity as a dead parrot. And you could say that this dead parrot is a perfect symbol of our time. Some people want to date the Anthropocene back to the Industrial Revolution. We might begin with the dead parrot, however, to talk about the end of a particular understanding of the human, a straight, heteronormative understanding of the human that has come, I hope, to an end. So this skit then speaks not only to the deadness of the parrot, but also to the inertia of a particular model of the human that, let's say, depends upon pet owning. So I would read this skit as saying not simply that this parrot is dead and this pet is dead, but that all pets are dead, to the extent that they are simply prosthetic extensions of the human who owns them. So what version of the human do pets sort of represent and extend? One that believes in life at all cost, in longevity over all else. One that believes in the reproduction as the meaning of all life, the family as the proper sort of natural extension of life itself. And moreover, the version of the human that comes to save animals. So a lot of people who are vegetarian but also own pets tell you that they saved the animal. One of the things that I really want to puncture is this idea that we are saving anything. We, particularly us here today, we are not going to save the world. If, in fact, the extinction of the human species is to be presented by us, we really are in serious trouble. And I think it's that very sentimentalist version of the human the one that owns pets and tells themselves that they have saved that pet, despite the fact that they now have this caged animal, caged as in it's basically locked up in their house, as a way of telling themselves, the pet tells them, you are a good human, you are a meaningful person. So the humanism that depends upon pet loving, but not bestiality, mind you, that's a whole different thing. You can kiss them, apparently, but you can't fuck them. Just saying. That version of humanism cannot save a world, and this is my main thesis, that it has been largely responsible for endangering in the first place, right? So you can't use the same version of humanism to save the world that has put us in this mess in the first place. So we've had a lot of scientists telling us today about extinction and how it's going to go down and why it's definitely true that we're in this precarious state. But who did that, all right? Who did that? It wasn't people in China serving up endangered species. It wasn't people in Africa who are starving. Who did that if not Euro-Americans, first world development, pollution that is a consequence of the good life that we all want to continue to live? So humanism of this variety that loves animals, that wants to have children at any cost, their own children preferably, despite all kinds of, physical barriers in the way, that version of the human cannot save the world that it, in the first place, endangered. So humanism, the irresponsible, reprehensible, continued investment in the idea of the goodness and rightness of liberal man must become extinct. Bring on the zombies to that end. So the dead parrot that lives on in order to confirm our humanity, makes us seem generous and kind, even as we cage another creature in our house, reminds us that every era produces its own zombies, and ours is no different. You just have to go to the cinema, turn on the TV, there are zombies everywhere. They are a particular image of our time, but there are many other times that have produced their own zombies, and I'll get to those in a moment. This is a great image from the American version of Zombieland, The Walking Dead, which gives us a new white patriarch to save us from the walking, stumbling, ambling masses who should be incarcerated but are now free to try to absolutely obliterate this guy and his friends. So I want to use the zombie, if you like, to poke a few holes in the comforting but utterly nonsensical notion that we, first world people, wealthy, art-loving, mostly white people, can save the world. The zombie, which is figured as all that threatens us, has, after all, been created by us. Now, we'll just do a quick detour through Foucault to try to understand how that might be so. So in his absolutely world-changing writings on life, death, and everything in between, French philosopher Michel Foucault described late 20th century bureaucratic systems of rule as biopolitical. And I'm going to talk for a moment about the biopolitical and the necropolitical. Now, by the biopolitical, he meant that the state generates versions of the good life that middle-class people cleave to, despite the fact that this good life depends absolutely on the loss of liberty, freedom, mobility, and choice for millions of others. So you choose life, knowing that by choosing that life, you are going to doom entire populations of people who will be incarcerated on your behalf, who will be shoved off to the edges of your world on your behalf, who will work for very little money on your behalf, and so on. But you make that bargain on behalf of a project that we call freedom. We, therefore, believe that we are choosing life, and I would call versions of this are embedded in something like what I call extreme reproduction, i.e., people wanting to reproduce way past their expiration date, right? So, you're infertile. You have no more reproductive options. IVF literally brings your reproductive potential back from the dead and makes it so that you can live to reproduce another day. So we have extreme reproduction. We have the redistribution of chances to marry. Okay, so here we are facing the apocalypse, and all gays and lesbians want is a chance to also be miserable for life in marriage. No, thank you. That is another version of zombieism. And have families instead of, what else could we be doing? Thinking about the redistribution of resources, thinking about why we want to live so long to the point of complete and total incapacity. Why life over everything else? In other eras, people have not lived or wanted to live as long as we do. But we choose life over everything else, and that choice consigns entire populations to death. We also choose property, cars, haute cuisine, and the list goes on. When we do so, we should be aware of the fact that we consign others to death. Food scarcity, homelessness, lack of birth control, limited access to health care, and as Ruthie Gilmore puts it in her definition of racialization, vulnerability to premature death. So that one population can live into a very, very old age, another population becomes immediately susceptible to premature death. So biopolitics is always sort of held up on the other side by necropolitics, by the distribution of opportunities in relation to death. So there are biopolitical opportunities in relationship to living a good, long life, and there are necropolitical opportunities that define others in relationship to death. So necropolitics consign some to death in order to preserve the good life for others. And this might be, your organic food markets, green homes. These are far from the markets of our survival. They're, in fact, available to very few people, in part because everyone else must make do with fast food and fast death. And so on to zombies. So let's think about the representation of the zombies now. And remember think about what they look like. They are the walking dead. They are the living dead. They are spectral. They are bloodied, wounded. They are, they have their guts falling out. They make visible, in fact, the impact of the biopolitical upon the body of the other. They make it visible. You see it. You see them rotting from the outside in. The zombie movie is nothing new. The zombie movie goes back to the 1920s, and there's a sort of, horrible colonial history of pulling this idea of zombieism out of Haiti, even as European colonialists completely savage Haiti, pulling this idea of the zombie out and using it to completely different ends to represent otherness as what is coming for us. Right? Instead of we being the rapacious, colonizing force, we represent the other as what's coming for us. And we call it the zombie. In Haiti, some people use the figure of the zombie to worry that they were going to come back from the dead and still be slaves. So there's a completely different history of the zombie that one could track. And then, of course, there's a great 1960s film, Night of the Living Dead, that projects zombieism onto a sort of mass population of consumers who have, I suppose, been brainwashed. So every era has its zombie. Let's think about our zombies, okay? And there are two series in particular that dominate the airwaves right now. The first is The Walking Dead from the US, which falls into the category of the necropolitical. Amazingly, and this is very American, amazingly, at the end of the world, you have a little clutch of white people who are all heterosexual. I kid you not. Chances are not good for that, actually. They're all heterosexual, and they survive often to the extent that they're coupled up and offer opportunity for reproduction, right? So, and that becomes the whole goal. So there's even one character who gets accused of being a lesbian, and it's like, oh, God, no. They've got zombies outside. She's worried about being accused of being a lesbian, and it immediately fastens onto a kind of repulsive guy. Anyway, so there's the American version, and what's astonishing is by season 3 in The Walking Dead, they arrive at a prison, and there's a whole prison population in the prison who are sort of safe in the prison. What do? They push them out. So the very people who have been put in prison to keep them safe in one world now have to be turned out in order for this same white, patriarchal little community to survive the apocalypse. All right, so that's The Walking Dead. Now, the UK version, of course, is actually biopolitical. And that's the graphic that The Walking Dead's from. What's amazing about The Walking Dead is that you're asked to believe that these are the good people, despite the fact that they slaughter everything in sight. Everything. I mean, this is just, it's like there's blood and guts all over the place in this film, in this series. Okay, so the British version is super biopolitical. I mean, you couldn't have a better rendition of a Foucauldian scene of biopolitics. So after the Rising in 2009, when all the dead come back to life, instead of slaughtering them, what do the British do? They rehabilitate them. Thank you. Lovely. Lovely. Great. Much better. Much better. Give you some meds. Some contact lenses, I believe, a little bit of counseling, you're good to go. So this is the perfect kind of biopolitical management of life at all costs. And the main character is a gay teen suicide who didn't want to live. He killed himself, all right? He'd had enough. He has to be brought back from the dead. And there's a kind of interesting anti-redemptive narrative that is embedded in that character that seems to me to be interestingly queer. Some of the zombie characters, the unrepentant, irredeemable zombie characters, remind me of other zombies in English literature. Perhaps the most recent was Renton from Trainspotting. I'm not going to read this in my bad Glaswegian accent, but basically Renton, if you remember from Trainspotting and the drug addicts, the zombies in that novel, and they're coming for you, again, the scary other. He says, they're telling us to choose life. But what is life? And that's an important question here where we're talking about extinction. What do we mean by life? Life at all costs? Life, only? Life always? What is life? And he says, they tell you to choose life instead of doing drugs. But what is life? Sitting in front of the TV, paying insurance, rotting in debt, having ungrateful children who shove you in a retirement home, and then sitting there till you die. He's like, if that's life, I choose drugs. Sounds reasonable to me. All right, we might say, and this is essay number 3, that there's a whole wing of art that's been very interested in, instead of giving us images of redemption and giving us something to hold on to in the face of extinction, that has been interested in autodestruction. And this, of course, is the work of Gustav Metzger that came to inspire this marathon on extinction. And I really want to think about this art. We'll get to that in a moment. Because one of the things that Gustav Metzger talked about was not wanting to make objects for the market, right? And he was very influenced by being a refugee from Nazi Germany and very aware of the fact that the aesthetic, far from being something that is an anathema to Nazism, is completely embedded in the National Socialist project. So beauty is something to be actually very wary of rather than to be something to hold on to in the face of doom, gloom, and extinction. So autodestructive art actually makes art that is immediately sort of eradicated so that there's nothing left for capitalism to batten onto, hold onto, and take elsewhere. This piece that he did from 2012 was really interesting to me. It has a sort of zombie ring to it, actually, because he sat for sessions of 20 minutes emptying his mind of all thoughts, and then the brain waves were transmitted to a little robot that drilled a hole in a piece of stone. And that was the art object, null object. So we get this art that both destroys the object, but also destroys the subject in the process. So this obliteration of the human that the zombie represents comes around in autodestructive art. And Metzger was said to influence Pete Townshend's guitar smashing act, and punk is a definite sort of opposition to that version of the human that I'm critiquing here. It's also plays a big part in Yoko Ono's Cut Piece, and you could see Cut Piece as a deeply feminist, anti-imperialist act within which she also kind of empties herself out as a subject and sits as an object, allowing people to cut pieces of clothing off her. And I would call this an art piece within which Yoko Ono unbecomes a woman, but also draws out this white patriarchal behavior as an Asian woman sitting on the stage. You see the white guy come up in the one recorded version on YouTube and literally try to dismantle her. There was also, although Marina Abramović would never call this feminist, there's something about drawing out the sadism in a male population, or a masculinist population at least, that informed Rhythm Zero, Marina Abramović's autodestructive piece. Okay, but what, oh yeah, and then this last group that I just want to talk about, and then I'll move to the queer version of this work. The Austrian autodestructive group from the 1960s connected with Gustav Metzger at some point. And this guy in particular, Gunther Bruce, he would like cover himself in viscera, in shit, in piss, like refuse to be a subject that anyone wanted to draw close to. But he also would go on these sort of situationist walkabouts, dressed in a kind of zombie mode, and he would draw these like lines down the middle of his body as if to blank himself out. And Gustav Metzger referred to this as his white dandy suit, and I think you could also see it as a kind of zombie performance. He was arrested, in fact, for this piece, walking along the streets of Vienna next to policemen dressed in zombie attire. All right, what about what about the queerness of autodestruction? So let me consider just a queer version of this, and then I'll move to my conclusion. There's a great performance by Heather Cassils, which some people may or may not know Heather Cassils' work. Cassils made himself into a sculpture, and in ways that are similar to Yoko Ono and Marina Abramović, but a little less hetero, decided to dismantle the being of woman, the female body, and dismantle it by building a new body for himself. So without the use of testosterone, without anything other than his own sort of bodily training, he literally trained himself to have this different kind of body. And so the whole performance, called Becoming an Image, is both a destroying of the female body and then a birthing of another kind of body that is not male or female, but that literally rips apart the gender system within which it's supposed to settle. So this is called Becoming an Image, and what the performance is Cassils is in the dark. It took place in the One Gallery, which is a queer archive in LA. In the dark, the only illumination comes from the occasional flashes of a photographer's flash camera. And in the dark, for about 20 minutes, he pummels this piece of clay, which is an interesting juxtaposition to the null object. Pummels it until at the end, when the lights go on, what you see is a destroyed piece of clay that is the sculpture, but also the destroyed body. The body has to be read as a kind of the shell of this gender system that he has left behind to become something else. So he himself, if you like, is the sculpture. All right, no future. This is my conclusion. So an entire body of work in queer theory has been dedicated to this concept of no future, both the punk version of no future, which is an end to a futurity that absolutely depends upon the child, that is always enacted on behalf of the child. We do this for the children, but is actually sort of a selfish biological project. And also the no future of an anti-normative, anti-social queerness in which the homosexual represents symbolically the end of reproduction itself. This is where the queer says if homosexuals have been made to represent sterility to heterosexual reproduction, rather than trying to get in on reproduction, particularly in this age of complete overpopulation of the earth, the homosexual says yes to sterility and agrees to represent no future. Okay, so we can't congratulate ourselves on reproductive abundance on the one hand and talk about overpopulation on the other. We somehow have to embrace this possibility of no future through thinking about possibly not reproducing ourselves, for which homosexuals should be thanked less and less nowadays, but there you go. So we might understand queerness here as a willingness to think outside of the biopolitical mandate to reproduce more of the same, and as a set of impulses organized around undoing, unbeing, failing, and unbecoming. For now, you are among the living, but in this world of serial disaster, you are always one step from the living dead. Zombies are the millions of bodies that exist between life and death in this era of end-stage development. The question is not life or death, but lives and deaths and everything in between. The living, walking, subturating dead are those bodies we have assigned to the gray zone between the good life and bare life. They include the incarcerated, refugees, the hungry, the terminally ill, the sick and the dying, the very young, the very old, the homeless, the drug addicts, the endangered species, the mentally ill, the disabled, the starving, the dispossessed, the occupied, the unsaved, unremembered, irredeemable, illegible, illegitimate, undead. The undead are hungry, they are angry, they are sick, and they are tired. And while you may look upon them with horror today, tomorrow you will no doubt try to save them in order to redeem a seriously compromised sense of your own humanity. But in the end, it is not you who can save the zombie. It is the zombie who will decide whether we live or die and whether survival will have been worth it. Thank you.